what I plan to talk about today is why would a laser physicist devote 30 years of his life to teaching remote viewing? That I could actually earn an honest living doing science in a laboratory. But what I found is that there's an opportunity to participate in a kind of expanded awareness that is really even more remarkable than the lights we see in the laser laboratory. What we find is that the two talks that have come just before me, Elizabeth Rauscher and Dean Radin, are enormously cheering for us. And what's cheerful is that we have found that we can do more than say the psychic ability exists or remote viewing exists. We're actually beginning to learn something about the phenomenology, how psychic functioning interacts with the physical and the psychological worlds that we think we understand something about. We can begin to describe the fact that meditation actually helps you get in touch with your psychic self. I'm very sympathetic to the model that Elizabeth Rauscher presented yesterday. It's a paper that we jointly wrote, and that'll be published in the JSC next month, and is an outgrowth of work we've done together for 20 years. So of the various things that I'm going to talk about today, the most important thing I could tell you is that the idea that we live in a non-local world is probably the most important thing that you could carry away from the conference, in my opinion. Non-locality is not a New Age idea. It's an old idea. As Einstein observed in 1935 that quantum mechanics predicts that as photons travel away from each other at the speed of light, they are still connected to each other to some extent with regard to physical measurements. And since that violates the idea of special relativity, Einstein said that means that quantum mechanics must have something the matter with it. He said that this kind of connection is a spooky or telepathic connection at a distance, and that couldn't be right. Well, his analysis was correct. That is, when you actually do the experiments, which started in 1969 and have carried on to the present, these photons are connected to one another. And it's as though you have twin photons. You have identical twins born in the laboratory. They travel away from each other at the speed of light. The experiments that we like were done in Switzerland, and you had the source of the photons in Zurich. One photon goes off to Basel, the other one goes off to Zurich or Geneva. You turn the polarizer in Geneva, and the man in Basel observes that something has happened instantaneously, not at the speed of light, but instantaneously. So this is an instantaneous correlation that transcends our previously understood idea of space and time. And the reason I like to talk about twin photons is this is very much like the literature in books on twins that you read. You have two twins who are born in the same hospital. One stays in New York and one goes to Boston. One stays in New York and one goes to California. It turned out as they grew up, there was an error in the documentation, and both of them became James. So these two twins, both named James, they both married a woman named Linda and divorced her, then both married a woman of another name, and each had a son, and they finally got to, and there were other correlations, but they finally got together. They both became firemen, and they were written up in Scientific American about 2 years ago. They showed these two twins named James in their fire hat. They both became fire chiefs. So although there are certainly correlations that come about as a result of genes, you can imagine two men who are twins, they both musicians or they both become artists, but we don't think there are any Linda genes, and we don't think there are any fireman genes. And so we think that there's a kind of correlation, I would say, because these people are physically identical, there's an opportunity for a resonance between them that will make them continue to be coherent. It's a kind of non-local connection between these twins, these twin men, and if you're interested in this kind of thing, there are a number of books on twins who show these amazing connections. But the idea of the non-local connection is the best description for psychic ability we have today. Some of the interesting things that we know about psychic functioning and remote viewing that interest me most as a physicist is there is no more difficulty in describing a picture that I'm going to show you tomorrow that has not yet been chosen than there is to describe a picture that's in an envelope today hidden from view. That is to say, your awareness is able to expand into the near future with exactly the same ease as it is to describe something in the hidden present. And there have been a number of experiments showing that particular correlation. Probably the most extensive is a lengthy paper by Chuck Honorton and work done by Bob, John, and Brenda Dunn at Princeton University. All of the experimental facts and data that I'm going to be talking about are described in my book, Miracles of Mind, that's here, and there'll be no other commercial message. I just want to tell you that we have citations for all the different kinds of miracles that I'll be talking about. And when I say they're miracles, when we publish papers in the Proceedings of the Electrical Engineering Society or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, what we present is something that looks like a scientific experiment. There's a hypothesis, there's data, there's statistical analysis, and there's a conclusion. But basically, we've taken a miracle and then wrapped it up in all the preparations and wrappings of the academic and scientific apparatus to make it look as though we know it's happening. But phenomenologically, all we can say is we have done this and this, and something has occurred. We think that the complex Minkowski space model that Elizabeth described yesterday is not necessarily the answer for how ESP works. We don't know the answer for how ESP works. But the description of the space-time that we live in as profoundly interconnected fits very, very well with the data. What does not fit is the mental radio model. Upton Sinclair wrote a wonderful book in the 1930s with his intensely psychic wife, where Sinclair would look at pictures and his wife would make drawings greatly resembling these pictures. And radio was in its infancy then and very exciting, and he said, this is mental radio. We know that cannot be the right answer, even though it's very appealing. We still have the idea that I'm going to send you a psychic signal and you'll pick up my signal. We feel that that's what's going on, but that cannot be what's going on, because what the data support is that sitting in the laboratory at SRI, where we did all of our work, we are just as able to describe what's happening in the far reaches of Soviet Siberia as we are to describe what's happening across the street. The distance from an experiment where you might put your head against the head of your friend and visualize something and tell your friend, I am visualize something, and she can then describe what you're seeing, what you're visualizing. Or you can do that with somebody 10,000 miles away, and being head-to-head, disappointingly, does not at all improve the psychic connection. So what that shows is that increasing the distance by a factor of 1,000,000 times further away in no way interferes with the accuracy or the reliability. Now, we really hate that as a physicist because it doesn't make any sense. But the data is extremely strong. We did experiments with Pat Price where he sat in the laboratory with us and described what was going on in the Soviet Union at a weapons factory. And those experiments were so successful that they were probably single-handedly responsible for the continuation of our program for another decade. His description was so accurate that we had a congressional investigation where I got to stand in the same well of the Congress as President Clinton got to stand defending himself on another issue. And we had this whole committee on House Committee on Intelligence Oversight, wanting to know how these guys at SRI were cheating, because what they're doing was impossible. But our supporters from Defense Intelligence Agency and the Air Force and the CIA showed up and said, there is no way, nobody in the Western world had the information that we were able to provide, and the congressional mandate was to press on. I was with the program for 10 years, and the program went on for more than 20 years. So one of the really paranormal things about the work at SRI, if any of you have ever tried to get money from the government or grant support, it's very difficult to get your contract awarded. It's even more difficult to get it renewed. We had our contract renewed year after year for more than 20 years to basically do the same kind of work. That would be a paranormal event all by itself, even if we weren't doing ESP research. But what we found, without a doubt, is that, and then after I left the program, I went on a couple of trips to the Soviet Union to do remote viewing demonstrations for the Soviet Academy of Sciences to show them what we were doing. And it turned out they were doing very similar things. And one of the things that troubled those experimenters that were going on in Soviet Armenia is that frequently the person in the laboratory would describe the target before it was actually selected. So they considered this a kind of psychic noise, and we told them that that often would happen. And in fact, in our work at SRI, one of the clues to us that there was a more complex phenomena taking place is that Pat Price would occasionally say to me, we don't really have to wait for the travelers to get to their outbound site. Why don't I tell you right now where they're going to be, and then we can go get some coffee? And he did, those were some of his most successful trials. So the thing that is evident is that our awareness is able to transcend our understanding of space and time, indicating that it is a non-local connection. And as a result of being a non-local connection, it's a non-energetic connection, which is, in a way, even harder to believe. That is, you are not sending psychic energy to the person you're communicating with, because if you were sending any kind of energy, then the fall-off that you would expect with sound energy or heat energy or electromagnetic energy or vibratory energy, it falls off as a square of the distance by the nature of the three-dimensional space we live in. No such fall-off is seen. What that means, and what we hypothesize, is that the result of our living in a non-local space means that it means that we're all connected to one another. There are a number of other physics ways of saying that. This is not a new idea, incidentally. The first people who said that we're connected to one another is in the Buddhist writings 2,500 years ago. The comprehensive writings of Buddha are called the Prajna Paramita. Prajna is wisdom, and Paramita is the highest, like a pyramid. So Prajna Paramita is the writings of Buddha. And on essentially every page, it's a very holographic writing. On every page is a message that in consciousness there is only one of us here, and that separation is an illusion. That we appear to be separate from one another, but in consciousness there is no separation. And even before Buddha, the Hindus talked about Brahman, which is the description of the entire universe. And the principal teaching in a sentence of the Hindu theology is that Atman equal Brahman. This is a 2,500 year BC idea that the wise people sitting peacefully on a rock noticed that Atman, that is my awareness, who I am, is identical with all there is in the universe. So the idea that Atman equal Brahman is a statement of it's a theological statement of non-locality, that it could be no other thing. It says that our awareness and our being is literally coherent and congruent with the rest of the physical universe. And throughout all the Buddhist teachings, all the corollaries of the Buddha's teaching, in my opinion. I'm, of course, not a Buddhist scholar. I'm just a physicist trying to share my readings. But what I understand is that the repetition again and again that there is no separation is what leads the Buddhist teaching to the idea that our principal goal is one of compassion because there is only one of us here. So that when you go to the grocery store or the supermarket and find this recalcitrant, tired clerk, what you're really looking at is a mirror of yourself. And that encounter has the opportunity for whatever kind of angry, loving, transcendent, mirrored interaction you want to have, and you get to choose what that interaction is, because the evidence from psychic functioning, remote viewing, is that there is no separation in consciousness. All the data that we have seen and what we're going to continue to see in the rest of this conference is that there is no separation. The oldest person who wrote in detail about that, 100 years after Buddha, is a Buddhist grammarian named Patanjali, who I've talked about before to this audience. And I was introduced to him in the first year of the SRI program by our good friend Dean Brown, who's a great polymath and Sanskrit scholar. And what Brown pointed out to us, and what Patanjali wrote, is that we all have the ability, as we quiet our mind. Patanjali is writing about a path of transcendence. And what he says is that as you learn to quiet your mind, you will notice various things coming to you. You will be able to have interesting experiences of looking into the distance, looking into the future, diagnosing illnesses, and even healing people, and a number of other things beyond the scope of what I'm comfortable telling you about. But Patanjali felt that our expanded awareness profoundly put us in contact with the entire physical and non-physical world. And what he said is that as you learn to quiet your mind, you have the opportunity, just as a person looking in a pool of water in the ground. When every ripple in that pool of water has been stilled, you can then see a reflection of the moon with crystal clarity. As soon as there's any wind rippling the surface, then the image of the moon is, of course, greatly distorted, and quickly you won't be able to tell what it is. So I was very happy to see Dean Radin's data just a moment ago showing again and again that the people who had learned to take some control of their mind, the meditators and the people on the spiritual path throughout all the country with tens of thousands of individuals participating, the people who had made some effort through a systematic way to quiet their mind were in fact able to participate in this expanded awareness and describe the pictures and do the dowsing in his electronic worldwide web test. And of course, this is in line with what spiritual teachers have been talking about for millennia. But Patanjali said, that's not the reason I'm writing about this. That is, he describes the various kinds of mental noise that Ingo Swann has talked about, imagination and memory and analysis, was all well known to Patanjali 400 years before Christ. So what was very interesting for us as we studied with Ingo in the SRI program is to discover that this had all been essentially handled 2,400 years before we ever heard of remote viewing. This is not new stuff. But Patanjali said that these experiences you're having, this ability to look into the distance and look into the future, is actually just a stumbling block on the path to transcendence. Patanjali and the Buddhists had no interest at all in the fact that you're able to quiet your mind and find a parking place or forecast changes in the stock market. That was not their goal, but rather they were inviting you to quiet your mind to discover something much more important than which way the market is going. But in fact, they were inviting you to quiet your mind and find a way to discover who you are. which is what all the mystics mean by transcendence or self-realization. So there are many paths you can follow. That you can follow spiritual paths of any of the organized religions. What we find is that if you look at the mystic teachings of the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Gnostic Christians, the Kabbalistic Jews, or the Sufis in Islam, they are all describing the same path. They're all telling you that if you quiet your mind, you have the opportunity to experience the flow of loving awareness that we call God. It's not involving belief. None of these mystical persuasions are inviting you to believe in a body of Scripture. It's very scientific. They say that if you quiet your mind, if you find a way to stop the mental chatter, you have the opportunity to have a transcendent experience which will, in general, change your life. Now, there are two different ways of pursuing this. With regard to finding out who you are, one of the things you can look at is at your name tag. When I came in, they pinned a name tag on me, and when you're 6 years old, you go to kindergarten, and they put a name tag on you, and it says Russell or Susie or whatever name tag they stick on you, and for the rest of your life, you look at your body and say, well, I must be Susie, because that's what it says here, and you have an association between who you think you are and your physical body. All of these spiritual persuasions are encouraging you to notice something different. And the relationship between these spiritual pursuits and remote viewing is that remote viewing is one of the ways, a very simple way, to discover that you are not a physical body. Obviously, we have physical bodies. We are an awareness that resides in a physical body. We have aches and pains and pleasures and all kinds of activities, and then we die, or the physical body goes away, but that doesn't pertain to who we are or to what our awareness is doing. Now, there's a tremendous desire to be attached. As when we want to know who we are, I have a business card. I think of this as my story card. And it says something or other today. It says I'm a physicist and a writer. That's today's story. Tomorrow might be an entire different story, and we get extremely attached to the story that we carry around with us. And we have the opportunity, through the expanded awareness that we have in remote viewing or other activities, to discover that there is more to us than the story that we tell. With remote viewing, we inflow information. We quiet our minds. There's no doubt if you want to do remote viewing, you have to find some way to stop the chatter. And we inflow information. And to a greater or lesser extent, we are then able to describe what's in our environment or what's in our future. And I'll talk about some of the experiments that we've been doing in a little while. The other thing that you can do is you can outflow your healing intention. Some of the most interesting and most widely accepted work today pertaining to the general field of ESP research or parapsychology is the outflow of healing intention, where, as Patanjali said, you're able to describe what's wrong with people, do medical diagnosis, and heal the sick. And increasingly, people are doing research in this area where they're able to demonstrate in clinical hospital settings the efficacy of prayer, even if you don't believe in it. So one of the things that we've learned is that if you're sick and you're an agnostic, accept the prayers anyway, because the scientific data indicates that they're efficacious whether you believe in it or not. Now, two of the ways you can view what we're doing here is the path of the sorcerer or the path of the shaman. And an earlier talk really stimulated me to digress somewhat from what I was going to tell you about, because I think the path of the sorcerer and the path of the shaman are extremely apropos to what we're doing here in remote viewing. For 10 years, I had an opportunity to sit in the dark with my eyes shut working for the CIA. So in a certain sense, I was a psychic spy for the CIA and found God. It's like one of his Reader's Digest articles. Because in the work we did at SRI, frequently a visitor would be closeted with me in the laboratory, and I would wind up showing that person how to do something psychic. They would come from the Pentagon right up to the Undersecretary of Defense during our CIA days, and they would all want to see something psychic. My task was to show them how to do it, to give them an experience so that when they would go away, it wouldn't disappear. They wouldn't think that we had tricked them with some super psychic who was living with us, but rather right up to the undersecretary and many other government officials, they would have a direct experience of some kind of remote viewing or psychic functioning, so that they would describe where their buddy had been taken, and then we would show them the location, and they would have the direct experience that they had described and experienced something they would see at a later time. And we were happily doing that for a decade. On my side, as I got to spend all this time sitting in the dark as a kind of psychic travel agent, I got to travel many, many different places. In one case, I was working with my friend Hala Hamid, and we were looking into Brezhnev's Kremlin office. And we did that for 2 hours. And the two of us together, I as the analyst interviewer, she as the psychic, would travel through the Kremlin describing different interesting things we saw. And it was a kind of afternoon group activity that we could do together. And then many years later, I actually got to the Kremlin and see the office and see the remarkable things that she had described as surprising things like a leather-covered door that was all held together with upholstery tacks. And I had never seen padded red leather doors before, and other extremely accurately described things. But I was this psychic guide. Ingo Swan showed us how to do remote viewing briefly, and then we got to figure it out with other quite inexperienced people. But we were functioning in many ways not as shamans, but as sorcerers. That is, we're using psychic ability in service of our own ego, in service of our own small self. I did experiments forecasting changes in the silver commodity market. They were very, very successful. And we're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and Nova made a program about, this is just after I left SRI, Nova made a program featuring the fact that we had enthusiastic investors and Wall Street people, brokers participating in this associated remote viewing in the silver market. And the sorcerer's path, a sorcerer is somebody in a society who will make use of psychic abilities to pump up his own ego and to serve the personal material needs of another person, and not necessarily in a bad way. The sorcerer might help you find a wife, or find your car keys, or find a well, or do a whole variety of other things, mainly positive, sometimes negative. A shaman, on the other hand, is not at all concerned with the material plane. The shaman will help you find out who you are, or a shaman is concerned with healing and medical diagnosis in service of the community, and he uses his expanded awareness to participate in nature and the spiritual plane. Now, I was slightly concerned hearing a general description of psychic ability as a martial art yesterday. I think that that's a coherent view, and we did that for many years. I'm very familiar with remote viewing as a martial art, and I think that that's a correct construal, But I think that if that is your view as a teacher, then you are limiting your student in what he or she might experience. I think that remote viewing is a surprising, new agey way of describing something that has been in the field for millennia. And what we discover is that between this inflow of psychic ability, inflow of remote viewing data, so that we can know and experience what's happening in the world, and the outflow of healing intention, between those two places, by a physics continuity argument, if your mind is able to inflow data and outflow intention, between those two places, we know there must be a quiet place. And when you learn to reside in that quiet place, you have the opportunity for the transcendent experiences that the mystics have talked about. You have an opportunity for the oceanic experiences that are beyond remote viewing, but allow you to have the direct experience of connection with other people and with nature and with the physical universe. In the Christian tradition, they would say you have the opportunity to reside in love. In the Christian teaching, they say that God is love, which I, as a non-Christian, found difficult to deal with. People would say that to me, and I thought that people say God is love simply to annoy the non-believers, because nobody ever explained what that all could possibly mean. And as you discover what the different mystical traditions are teaching, you find that they are all teaching the same thing. Each of them provides you with a path. You have the Torah, the Old Testament, or the New Testament, or the Koran, or the Bhagavad Gita. All of these deal with the issue that you are already connected to a kind of psychic internet in consciousness. You already have that connection. And these holy books are really a kind of sacramental software that allow you to discover how to become aware of the connection you have between yourself and a higher self or God or something beyond your physical reality. So I would encourage you to think about remote viewing certainly as an application in the material plane. Nothing wrong with the material plane. We all have to eat and pay our mortgages and do the different things that we all worry about. But remote viewing has a much larger opportunity to give us. And the title of my talk is when I say our talk, this is my partner Jane Katra and I have been traveling to all kinds of places teaching remote viewing. In fact, we've been several times to Italy. Recently, we gave a talk in San Jose, and I had a chance to tell the people, we've been teaching remote viewing for several years, and this is the first time we get to do it in English. Now, teaching in Italy is certainly more fun, because in Italy, nothing starts without a hug and a kiss on both cheeks. So that might account for our good results. But in the teaching we're doing, we're trying to encourage people to become in touch with their greater selves, and really go forward with the shamanic path, the healing path, rather than just the what's in the box. I would like to hear about more applications in the wider field for psychic abilities. So what I'm going to do right now is show you some of the things we've done on our Italian adventures. Now, it was very hard for me to wean myself away from my favorite slides from the prodigious psychics like Pat Price, Ingo Swann, Joe McMonagle, Hella Hammond. Next year, we'll have the 30th anniversary of remote viewing, because Ingo came to SRI and the program started in 1972. So next year, we can show all of our favorite slides and show what these remarkable people were able to do in the laboratory during this classified program. Today I'm going to show some slides of what some very nice Italian women were able to do in their very first remote viewing trial. And in our experiments, in our teaching, we'll typically have 20 or 30 people in a class working with a translator, where I will talk about remote viewing and give them some simple exercises in a group. Jane, as a spiritual teacher, will allow them to experience coherence in consciousness through a meditation and experience the direct transmission of a loving presence. And after that softening up process, we will then do a formal remote viewing double-blind trial the next day. So let's see what these slides look like, which I have never shown before. So what we start with is a collection of remote viewing targets. We have 4. Each person has a task. What we're doing with this group today is a replication of the experiments that we've been doing in Italy. So each person in this experiment that we would be teaching would be asked to describe the picture in a white envelope that your partner is holding. And they would then give a description. After they give their description, their partner would bring the sealed envelope and the 4 pictures to our table, and we would then guide them through an interpreter to try and match which of the 4 pictures. So here you have 4 different pictures. One is chosen randomly. Here's a random picture in an envelope, and it's this person's task to try and decide. Here's your confused judge. This is the interviewer. So the interviewer has now been sitting with you. The interviewer has been sitting with you, trying to extract from you the information in the sealed envelope. The interviewer then comes up to our table. We show them the 4 possible pictures, and the poor interviewer, who's a judge, then has to describe which of the 4 pictures the viewer was trying to describe. And then they would swap. The interviewer becomes the viewer, and the viewer becomes the interviewer. So each person has an opportunity to learn something about helping to extract psychic information in addition to doing that. So I'm showing you a few samples of what happened here. In one of our first series, here are the 4 pictures. You have a garden scene, a waterfall, a sort of formal garden, and some columns. The random number generator in the beginning chose the columns as the correct target. The viewer, first ever remote viewing, after an hour or so of instruction and 1 practice trial, the viewer wrote down in Italian, there's a cement with the sky above, and he sees these columns. So that was his mentation. This is all very simple and speedy. Everybody had 1 piece of paper, and the name of the facility we're speaking at Arco in northern Italy. So this fellow just wrote down what he saw, sky above, made of cement. Then his interviewer brought the picture that he drew up to our table. There are 4 pictures. 1 was randomly chosen, and she, of course, had no trouble matching his drawing with the correct target. So here's another one of the similar type. You had 4 possible pictures. You had some mountains, ruins, a mosque of some kind, and a waterfall. And the person here said, I see a building with some domed roofs and crisscross windows. And again, the interviewer was able to match these. So we thought that was very successful. We were happy with the results of that. As a result of this first experiment, we did 24 people in the series. Each person did one trial. You'd expect a quarter of them to be right. Our observed hit rate was not 25%, but was 58%, and the odds of that happening by chance is 5 times 10 to the minus fourth. That is, out of 24 trials of this type, we had 16 first-place hits. 16 first-place hits where you would expect 6. So this is an extremely efficient experiment. For those of you who think about effect size, this is an effect size of more than 0.6. And that's an effect size that's like 100 times greater than Ryan saw in his card guessing experiments. It was really astonishing. And these people had a day of instruction in getting in touch with their psychic selves. Following year, we went back and had a similar group. I'm just showing you, I know that people like to see what first-timers do. These are all people who had never done anything like remote viewing. They just signed up for a class. So here a person drew an arch with some people underneath, and of course there are no people, but the arch was easily matched by a judge. In this case, we had little haystacks. These are all pictures from a set of 20,000 photographs in the Corel public domain set of pictures. So here we have the haystacks of the target, and the person drew these little knobs which don't show up very well. Are these visible? Is this other picture visible? Well, we can go on. This is more visible. Here you have a nice-looking freestanding house. The person drew a building greatly resembling that. This is a picture of the Parthenon. I particularly like this person's drawing because they're drawing with a kind of fragmented Parthenon. I apologize that the other slide was not visible. In this case, the elements of the structure are fragmented. They just saw one piece at a time, never did put it together, but this fellow was able to just draw what he saw, one fragment at a time. And this kind of fragmentation is the hallmark of remote viewing. If you have a good interviewer who never asks the person, tell me what it is, but just asks increasingly to describe your impressions, what you're seeing, what the fragments are, you can wind up putting together a description or drawing such as we have here. And this looks like it comes right out of the famous book Mind to Mind by René Worcollier, which will be available in the fall. I'm bringing out a number of classic and consciousness books, including Mental Radio, which is now available, which is the first detailed ESP book that's been published with formal experiments. That has an introduction by Einstein. Worcollier's work was very influential to Ingo Swann. That's called Mind to Mind and will be available in the fall. This fragmented picture was extremely similar to the ones that he observed in his experiments. Worcollier was a French chemist and talked about the sources of mental noise and the importance of separating memory and imagination from the fundamental remote viewing image. Altogether, this is the total of our Italian experiments. We were at 3 different places. We were in Milano, in Tuscany, in a little town called Poggibonsi, and in the north of Italy, in Arco. What you notice is that 2 of the experiments we did were strongly significant more than 1 in 1,000. As you had people getting
15 out of 26 first-place matches and 14 out of 24 first-place matches, which is just to reiterate, a very striking, efficient kind of remote viewing and very high effect size. The Pajibansi people did not have many first-place matches, but they had 16 out of 20 in the upper half. That is, where people were making decisions, is this the first or the second place, which is the first place target, which best matches you're drawing, which is the next best match. Although they didn't have a lot of first place matches, they had highly significant of the gestalt in the upper half. So this is all very interesting to us in that this is quite easy to communicate to people rapidly in a loving environment. Let's see, I think that's the end of my slides here. So we can turn off the slides. So the idea is that in the remote viewing we're doing, we're teaching people to do something beyond looking into the envelope or doing the object in the box trick. What we're trying to encourage people is to look inside themselves as much as looking inside the box. Now, the strength of the remote viewing is that we are able to do experiments with an effect size hugely greater than had been done before. This card guessing is not a good rendition of, not a good match for what psychic functioning really pertains to, because card guessing involves the use of symbols where you know what the symbols are in advance. So if I tell you I have a square or a circle, what do you see? That's an essentially impossible task, except for Ingo Swann. Ingo did a series of experiments with Ed May, which I think has not yet been published, but I've known about this for many years. Ingo was interested in learning to separate out. That's much worse. Ingo was interested in separating out the psychic signal from his mental noise. So he did a series of several hundred trials, which I think of as the hardest possible remote viewing experiment, whereas each day somebody at SRI would select two possible targets. For example, rectangular cross-section graph paper and circular graph paper, and then using a random number generator would choose one of those and then ring a bell over the phone for Ingo. So Ingo is now sitting in his loft in New York, and he knows that somebody is staring at either rectangular graph paper or circular graph paper. He has a perfect image of both of those things in his awareness. And after a period of several weeks of experiments, he got up to an 80% correct hit rate, separating out known targets one for the other, which is really an inspiration. It gives us an idea that even in these very, very difficult analytical tasks, where people are always asking you to read words or guess numbers. Now, reading words and guessing numbers is, of course, a very difficult task, but if you have talent and are willing to practice, then apparently this can actually be accomplished. The healing work that's being done, the outflow of psychic impression, the outflow of healing intention, is the most favorably reviewed kind of psychic functioning going on today. In this healing work, groups of healers around America in 3 different laboratory hospital experiments that have been published will focus their attention on individual patients in the hospital. One of these has been done at California Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco. My daughter, Elizabeth Targ, is a psychiatrist and did this experiment with 60 AIDS patients, very sick men, and then using a random protocol, half were sent into the prayer for group, half were controlled. At the end of 12 weeks, the people who were receiving the prayers, the men in the study who were receiving the prayers, had many fewer opportunistic illnesses, fewer trips to the hospital, fewer days in the hospital, and much more robust feelings about themselves. Now, of course, all of the men wished to be in the prayed for group, but none of them knew which group they were in. And what this shows is that even in an experiment where people know everything that's going on, wish to be prayed for, there is a strong difference between the people who did not receive prayers and people whose pictures were looked at every day by experienced healers. And this was published in the Western Medical Journal. And two other very large studies, one done by Randall Burt, a study that's pretty well known, involving more than 300 cardiac patients, and another one by William Harris, involving many hundreds of cardiac patients. Both of these published in the Annals of Internal Medicine showed that the heart patients who received prayers also had much better outcomes. And there's even been a big meta-analysis of distant healing, which is what this is called, by John Austin, published Annals of Internal Medicine, showing that over all of the clinical studies, together with the work of William Broad and Marilyn Schlitz, there is strong evidence that our thoughts have effects in the material universe. Somebody asked Elizabeth Rauscher yesterday whether focusing your attention on something in remote viewing can affect it. And we know from a famous experiment that Ingo Swann did, where he was looking at a magnetometer in the basement of a physics building at Stanford, he was able to change the periodicity of a decaying field by his attention. We similarly are able to demonstrate now with these experiments in distant mental influence or distant healing that the effects of a well-intentioned healer are able to change the physiology of a distant person. Now, the basis of all of this, that is the way of communicating this, is to give you the idea that there really is no conflict between what I'm describing as a spiritual path or a plan to quiet your mind or a way to experience something outside yourself. There's no conflict between this and the scientific pursuits. That it is not necessary to be agnostic. It's not necessary to give up your engineering card or your rational person card in order to pursue this. Because what's found over the millennia is that the people who are teaching meditation, of which I am not one, but the meditation teachers and people in all the organized religions following a spiritual path encourage you to find a way to quiet your mind, follow a path, and report back what you're experiencing. It's like a lab report. There's no contrariness or contradiction with modern science. The Buddhists have been saying for 2,500 years, if you will do these steps, then you will have this quite surprising experience. You will find that you're able to quiet your mind and spend an increasing amount of time in a state of loving awareness instead of the state where you normally reside. So it's an opportunity, for example, to take control of your awareness, to take control of your mind, and determine what you experience. For example, you can wake up in the morning and experience what we often do, which is like fear, resentment, anger, concern about what's going to happen the rest of the day. Or you can wake up in gratitude for the fact that you woke up, the fact that you're in good health, the fact that you live in America rather than in Bosnia or some other country where there's strife and your life is at risk. And interestingly, a small amount of time devoted to waking up in gratitude, taking some control of your mind at the outset, will change your whole day, will change what you experience. And the well-known Buddhist teaching that with regard to reality out there, this alleged reality that we experience, and the idea that's very evident that we give all the meaning there is to everything we experience. Things occur, and we then get a chance to parse those in whatever way we want to parse them. C.S. Peirce, who's a pragmatist philosopher at the beginning of last century, wrote a paper that I like called the neglected proof of the existence of God. And he was not a religious man, on the contrary. But what he observed is that all of these spiritual traditions lead you in a path where people all wrote down the same experience. All of these people who quieted their mind had a very similar experience. And he felt that this could not be a coincidence. So even hardcore philosophers like the logical positivists, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the beginning of the 20th century, said that all this good discussion of religion is nonsense. That is, he was interested in sense data. Talking about God is obviously nonsense data. So people like Wittgenstein and Alfred Ayer and other positivists were happy to say that this is all nonsense. However, in their subsequent writings and the contact with the pragmatists, they began to feel that the experience that the mystics had were in fact data. So you'll be happy to know that the experiences you're having is not nonsense, but by the end of their lives, the logical positivists felt that actual experiences can be construed as data. And Wittgenstein, in his last book, said if we are to find meanings of our life in space and time, that meaning will be found outside space and time. In the perennial philosophy, which is the basis of all of what I'm describing today, the perennial philosophy is the common thread through the whole spiritual teaching of recorded history. This is not religious teaching particularly. These are experiential people, and they have four elements in the perennial philosophy. One is the holographic view of the universe, that the universe is more like a great thought than a great machine. And that particular thing was uttered by Gibbs, who was a distinguished 19th century physicist. The mystics and the Buddhists who came before him, of course, had other ways of saying that, but what they had in mind is that the universe is filled with waves, is filled with energy, and we here, as remote viewers, know for a fact that as you look across this auditorium, we significantly misapprehend the nature of the space-time in which we live. That we feel that there are a room full of individuals, a room full of chairs. From our remote viewing experience, we know that that can't be the whole story. So the idea of the distributed nature of space and time, the non-local interconnectivity of space and time, is part of the perennial philosophy. The good news is that our awareness is able to comprehend that. We are able, through our expanded awareness, to discover, although we reside in physical bodies, our awareness has the capability of transcending our physical locations and participating in an expanded world. The third element of the perennial philosophy is that we have a dual nature. That is, we do have a physical body, but we have an aspect of ourself that survives that physical body. Now, that's, of course, outside what remote viewers are concerned with, but the evidence that something survives is increasingly powerfully demonstrated, mainly from the work of Ian Stevenson, where his life work shows that children all over the world are born frequently with information pertaining to previous lives. So you have a 5-year-old who starts speaking words in another language, showing talents on an instrument he's never seen, calling for his wife or his mistress, or his wife and his mistress, and bringing adult emotions to meetings that he has with adults he felt he knew in his previous life. And occasionally, these are people who report having been killed violently, and these children can provide enough information, according to Stevenson, that occasionally the perpetrator is able to be brought to justice and put in prison based on information provided by a child who has information of the previous life. So the reincarnation is a strong part of the occasions and participating in an expanded world. The third element of the perennial philosophy is that we have a dual nature. That is, we do have a physical body, but we have an aspect of ourself that survives that physical body. Now, that's, of course, outside what remote viewers are concerned with, but the evidence that something survives is increasingly powerfully demonstrated, mainly from the work of Ian Stevenson, where his life work shows that children all over the world are born frequently with information pertaining to previous lives. So you have a 5-year-old who starts speaking words in another language, showing talents on an instrument he's never seen, calling for his wife or his mistress, or his wife and his mistress, and bringing adult emotions to meetings that he has with adults he felt he knew in his previous life. And occasionally, these are people who report having been killed violently, and these children can provide enough information, according to Stevenson, that occasionally the perpetrator is able to be brought to justice and put in prison based on information provided by a child who has information of the previous life. So the reincarnation is a strong part of the perennial philosophy. It's not particularly part of remote viewing or of a spiritual path, but it's an indication that people who have thought about these things and who have participated in the expanded awareness have these experiences. So although I would say as a scientist, the evidence that something survives, that evidence is very strong, but I wouldn't put off to next lifetime anything that you're planning to accomplish right now. The final element of the perennial philosophy is the idea that we have the opportunity to have this unitive connection. In the spiritual tradition, they would say it's a one with God connection. I might say that it's an opportunity to experience the flow of loving awareness, or the oceanic connection with all that is. But that experience is a transcending experience in that once having done it, it's very hard to get you back in aerospace. And it's a life-changing experience because what you discover is that there is much more going on than you had thought before you participated in the expanded awareness, of which remote viewing is a good key to give people an opportunity to take charge of their own mind. And the result of that, what the perennial philosophy teaches, is that after you've had that experience, the purpose of your life then becomes to help alleviate the suffering in the world and teach other people that that experience is possible, that experience is available, that there is more to us than the small self, there's more to us than what's written down on our story cards. And that's an opportunity that we all have. And what I encourage you to do is that is not hard to pursue. You just have to give up some of your favorite things, like anger and judgment, separation. I mean, one of the things you learn about judgment is that it hurts you more than it hurts the other people. That as you move along a path, you are aware that judging other people in other situations is a way of showing you that you're functioning logically, that you have noticed this and they did that other silly thing. Eventually, that becomes a painful thing to yourself, and you want to quit doing that. So along this path, it's necessary to find a way to give up this judging, fearful pursuit, and to wake up in gratitude. There's basically making a choice to wake up in gratitude, saying thank you to God or to the universe. You don't have to believe anything. Just stop the chatter when you wake up and say thank you. Another thing you have to do is find a way, some kind of pursuit, as Dean Radin was describing, to take charge of your mind, to get quiet, whether it's a meditation pursuit or some kind of path to allow you to quiet your mind. The third element, in order to have some kind of self-realization, now there are many things you can do that are in the general path of self-improvement. You can go to church on Sunday, you can be a good person, you can be kind to your friends, and there's nothing wrong with that. What could be wrong with that? These are all in the area of self-improvement, living a peaceful life, giving money to charity, being a good-hearted person. It's a very desirable thing to do. But there's a difference between self-improvement and self-realization. There's a Rumi, Hafiz is a successor to Rumi that I like a lot. Hafiz has a little poem that says, "Why are there so few people in the hall of the great teacher?" And the answer is that you have to leave a little piece of your ego with the hat check girl, and she won't give it back. Ouch. And in order to find a way to reside in this interesting area of loving awareness, you do have to give up a little piece of the story, and it hurts. And the final thing that you have to do is to decide that to accomplish this is the most important thing in your life, because there will always be something to stand in your way, to interfere with you doing that. So I encourage you to think about that as you're doing remote viewing, to think about the possibility to follow the shaman path along with the other path that you might follow. There is more to psychic abilities than psychic self-defense. So I encourage you to take part in this expanded awareness, to follow this trajectory, and I invite you all to be in love. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is it all perfectly clear? Are there any questions?
Okay, let me get to someone who hasn't had a question yet first. Go back here real quick. All right, go ahead.
Yes. I am actually interested in, when I try to learn something, I actually learn better by practicing it rather than just by attending a class. So I was wondering whether you are familiar with any kind of loose-knit group in the San Francisco Bay Area that kind of supports each other in trying to learn remote viewing.
The question, well, I think, as I understood the question is, do we have class in the San Francisco area? And in general, I'm not teaching remote viewing except on the occasional workshops. We have somehow developed a constituency in Italy, which I don't exactly understand, but they keep inviting us back, and it's a very attractive way to spend September. But Jane and I do occasional workshops pertaining to spiritual healing and remote viewing, but we don't do a lot of it. We do occasional 1 or 2 day workshops 2 or 3 times a year in America, and then this 4 or 5 week adventure in Italy. But in general, I'm not teaching remote viewing at all.
Okay.
The scheme or the practice that we worked out, we describe in detail in our book, Miracles of Mind. And the interesting thing, our publisher wanted us to do something psychic. Publisher said, if you're going to tell people how to do remote viewing, you ought to demonstrate that you two characters can actually do that. So Jane and I, together with our good friend physicist Dean Brown, did a series of 12 associative remote viewings to forecast changes in the silver future, and doing a redundant coding. That is, in order for the trial to count, Jane and I had to each agree that silver would go a particular way, and in the 12 trials in which we agreed, 11 out of 12 were correct. So it shows that even non-psychic writers and teachers can do remote viewing if you really, as Ingo would say, if the necessity level is high enough, you can learn to do it.
Okay. We have a real good question over here, he tells me. Over on this side to your right.
Yes, Russell, I have a two-part question. One has to do with getting clarification. Did you indicate or intend next IRVA conference to present the newly declassified 1972 viewings and work by Ed and Ingo? And the second part is, if so, do you anticipate the two jointly presenting that information?
Well, I'm certainly not presenting things that Ed and Ingo have done. That I'm not presenting any classified information, obviously.
Declassified?
The experiments that I just described that Ed and Ingo did is something that Ingo showed. I've been working with Ingo doing some other things, and Ingo showed me a detailed write-up that he was sent by SRI, obviously an unclassified document, describing this Herculean series of experiments that he did with Ed. And I think I mean, this is not new data. This is 2000. Those experiments are 12 years old. So this is not classified information. But I'm describing this experiment that Ingo told me about because I think that it's extremely important, because what remote viewers believe is that it's near impossible to do analytical remote viewing if somebody tells you that in the remote viewing terminology is dealing with front loading. That if somebody came to me and said, I have a picture here, it's either a square or a cross, I wouldn't think of trying to describe what's in the envelope, because the mental noise is way beyond what I could overcome. I think that it's probably scientifically important that a talented remote viewer who practices can actually learn to overcome this really significant front-loading mental noise. What I was mentioning about the pictures was really humorous, as I've been talking about remote viewing for 30 years, and this is the first time that I've weaned myself away from my favorite pictures of stuff we did at SRI to show that even 30 years later, people are still functioning psychically.
Okay, got a question back here.
Russ, you had us do an experiment. When are we going to work that? The remote viewing?
We have an experiment in progress right now. All of you have already, hopefully, made a little drawing of a picture that you're going to see at the end of the conference today, at the end of the proceedings today. If I should really have Paul describe this. If what Paul's told me is correct, then all of you have been invited to make a drawing of a picture that you'll be shown at a later time. Each of you has a picture assigned to you based on the last number of your telephone number. So sometime after the end of the session, whenever that is, 5 o'clock or something, I don't know when the end of the session is, there'll be a number of us in the hallway with pictures to show you. So each of you will be shown 4 pictures. Let's say you're in folder number 3. You know that your phone number ends in 3. You will find station number 3, and some helpful person will show you, here are 4 pictures. One of these is your picture. Which one do you like? You say, well, I give a pretty good description of this picture. The person will then write down, your choice is that picture, and you will then go to the master of ceremonies at the end of the hall, who will show you the correct picture that goes with your target set.
Okay. We have a question over here to your right again.
One of the more frustrating aspects, I think, of remote viewing is the lack of acceptance by mainstream science and mainstream journals. And this is from Victor Stinger's book, Physics and Psychics, talking about your early research with Pat Price. He indicated that a couple of New Zealand researchers attempted to duplicate your research and came up basically with different results, and then later visited you and Hal Puthoff and basically found what they thought was leakage in the information, which then discredited your work, which then was published in the journal Nature. Your original work was reluctantly published, and then there was nothing for a while, and then finally, when this, I guess, skeptical debunking or whatever you want to call it went on, the Nature latched onto that and did publish that. Would you just comment about that? It was Marx, I think, and
Marx and Kamen.
Heyman, yes.
I mean, your recitation is entirely true. Marx and Kamen read our description of how to do remote viewing in the proceedings of the Electric Engineering Society. They did a series of formal experiments that failed, because there are a lot of ways to make a remote viewing experiment fail, principally by showing your viewer all the targets in advance, which is what they did. So it was not surprising to us that their experiment didn't work. They then came to our lab and felt that our transcripts contained clues that would allow a judge to identify the targets by analytical means rather than judging their psychic content. That was published in Nature. Charlie Targ at UC Davis then edited the transcripts to remove anything that could be of a temporal nature, so that a judge had no way of telling which target came before which target. And he had them rejudged by analysts at UC Davis and got exactly the same results that we had, and Nature published our rebuttal to Marx and Kamen. We then did another exact series of 9 trials with Hella Hammond, same protocol in which we carefully cleaned up the transcripts in advance, randomized them, and got even more significant results with Hella than we did with Pat. It's worth saying one more word about that. Hella has become a well-known remote viewer, and now, unfortunately, she died in 1992, but Hella came into the program as a control subject. CIA wanted to see what would an ordinary person do. Pat Price and Ingo Swann were already famous psychics, so we brought in Hella as a control. Hella turned out to be the most reliable psychic that we ever worked with.
Interesting. We have a question over here to your left.
Actually, it's a comment. I realized that my analogy kind of got misconstrued. I totally agree. I know my personal experience is that my own personal spirituality has grown in leaps and bounds with my involvement in remote viewing. And in choosing kind of the analogy of martial arts, I meant to include, and probably didn't make clarified, is the fact that almost all major martial arts traditions include a meditative component. And that meditative component is designed to teach the individual respect for and responsibility for the interconnectedness. So while, you know, there is the martial component of martial arts, there is also that meditative interconnectedness, consciousness, responsibility component. So I don't want, I'm glad that this surfaced, because that should be a component of why anybody would pursue remote viewing. It is very much something that can increase somebody's spirituality and be used in positive ways in that way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That wraps up pretty much the time we have here, but listening to all this stuff about remote viewing and being one with the universe and stuff, I guess that makes you my Yoda, doesn't it? A little bit of a joke there.